So the planes that generally exist in architecture can be sort of classified based on their general orientation. So of course planes can sort of be oriented in any sort of way, any sort of angle. In general, the ones that we interact with are sort of like either essentially base planes along the ground, wall planes, which are vertical planes, or overhead planes. And just to think about them separately, the thing is that these three orientations of how planes can be arranged, they really affect how space is defined, and also sort of how we imagine space and how we interact with it and are affected by it. And so if I were to be a little philosophical for a moment, and you can sort of take or leave this as a sort of a helpful guide, but essentially that the three types of planes could very well be represented by the concepts of base plane being the self, wall plane being society, and the overhead plane being sky. So the base plane, ourself, so we are intimately associated with ground planes. So we really have no choice but to be in contact with them all the time because of the force of gravity. And in general, they're the planes that we sort of like have the most contact with. We interact with the most. We touch them constantly. We walk on them. Their resistance, the way that they hold us up from falling from gravity, I guess. So for a 30th floor of a building, the ground plane underneath us keeps us from falling down to the lower level. We sort of trust the ground plane. It's, like I said, something we are intimately connected to, and it's what all architecture is sort of built on top of. So wall planes, represented in this by society, they're primarily used to create the boundaries to spaces, and we, as opposed to the ground plane or the base plane, which we walk on, wall planes, we primarily interact with them through our visual field, and we interact with them by touch only by choice, if we feel like walking up against them, resisting against them. But it's something we have that choice in it. So wall planes can be antagonistic in that they could be limiting our abilities, our view. They could be limiting our knowledge. They could, they're limiting our movement, of course, because we can't sort of move through them readily. But they can also, wall planes can also be comforting. They can be friendly. They can provide privacy and safety from enemies. So then that last brings us to overhead planes, which are representing by sky. So while we walk on ground planes on the base plane, and we sometimes interact with the wall planes as we sort of navigate, typically the overhead plane is out of reach. We don't interact with it a whole lot. In most spaces, it's too high up for us to reach up and touch it. So, but its presence affects sort of the feeling of shelter and enclosure more strongly than either of the other two planes, as we'll see in just a moment. But often, overhead planes, instead of being physical boundaries so much as far as like gameplay space, they tend to define or strike a emotional tone. So as you'll often see sort of in sacred architecture, like temples, cathedrals, that sort of thing, where these are spaces that are sort of meant to inspire awe by pushing that overhead plane far above, way out of the reach of us normal humans. So let's get back to my case study of sort of trying to build this 10 by 10 by 5 rectangular shape using planes now. So we'll start with the ground planes. So here back to our field and our rocks and our broken column, you can quickly see how just essentially creating a definition of a ground plane space very quickly creates a sort of a volume or a shape that I can stand within a lot more strongly and definitively than just sort of points or lines alone. So essentially, I guess you could say that because this is a plane is defined by lines and by points. So essentially kind of an infinite amount of points and lines that, so obviously that's why it's sort of stronger as an element. But you can also combine this with other points like these rocks here, or if I want to go back to sort of my column, my step, and here, just using the ground plane, it's really hard to sort of get a sense of the overall volume, but essentially combining it with a couple of linear elements quickly sort of evokes that. Here we have some sort of broken wall segments, and this is sort of almost starting to get into sort of the wall plane, and it very clearly in the far corners is creating this this rigid sort of corner structure. And much like the broken pillars that we were looking at before, we have a sense that there was a structure here once that someone wanted to define as an architect. They wanted to have a room, and it's since broken down, but the idea of the structure sort of remains with us. So making the ground plane elevated, makes this even stronger. There's more of a barrier to entry in order to get into this space, because we have to walk up a couple of steps. Of course, that's not a huge amount of sort of a barrier of entry, but it's significant. It places this as a space of significance. So much so that, like, essentially this combined with maybe just a single column creates almost the full image of the volume that we're going for. So of course this kind of, I guess you could say it's more of a dome shape perceptual sort of volume here, but it's getting there. And contrast this with if we were to take this ground plane and inset it, this becomes even sort of a stronger shape, not only because of the fact that I guess there's no stairs in here, so actually dropping into here is more of a commitment than and more of a definition of a defined space than just walking in on stairs. But it also, in setting like this, is almost starting to create sort of the wall planes around this and really defining sort of that volume. So let's look now at let's set aside ground planes for just a moment and talk about wall planes and how they can create space. So back to our rocks in the field, and we've got a wall here, and as you can see, the wall alone, if the rocks were not here, would not be creating much of a sense of volume on its own, although it can create, it very precisely creates a height and width that does not define the sort of length here, and sort of the rocks are sort of necessary in order to do that. As opposed to like a ground plane, I guess you very much have a sense of a ground plane on its own, being able to walk into it and understand that I'm within a new space. A wall doesn't really do that. It needs, sort of helper shapes like this. So we could add sort of a linear element here. Now we have sort of a extruded volume perceptual shape here. Let's combine this now with our idea of a ground plane, though, and very much we're starting to create the sense of a volume here. More iterations here, more linear shapes, and another point with a broken column. Bring in an elevated ground plane and full column, and now we're looking at this this little sort of half wall or short wall sort of shape, which is also a ground plane, but also doesn't completely sort of fill up that sort of space. More and more so broken wall planes that used to be extend upwards. So we're getting a very strong sense of the volume here, and even more so when we start to add kind of columns here. So this very much, we feel like there's a volume to this space. Interestingly enough, if we were to not have a wall plane all the way against the wall as opposed to in the center, it doesn't really matter. It's still creating sort of this volume. We have a combination of sort of the ground plane and the wall that creates this sense of volume. And even stronger if you sort of combine the walls, and this is probably the strongest that we looked at so far, of creating a volume of a shape. It's very clear that between these two walls is a defined shape that has identity and has sort of an inside and an outside, as volumes do. And even if we were to sort of take away sort of the outer corners of this shape and go with something like this, we don't have the outer corners defined, but they're almost sort of imaginary. We can almost like see where these lines, this line corresponds with this line, and they would meet up right here and create sort of the overall volume of a space. Now let's look at, finally, overhead planes. So obviously this is probably not something you'd see in the real world unless you had, I don't know, this could be a tarp that's extended with ropes or something like that to define sort of the space underneath. But even more than just the ground plane or alone, although the overhead plane doesn't articulate very well the shape on the ground, you sort of have to imagine that it very well articulates the sense of a height and a volume. And so you could understand as you sort of walk under it, you understand the fact that you are entering into a defined volume. So we'll help it along a little bit with some rocks along the ground to sort of like start to reinforce the ground, and very much like the sort of wall planes that we had on sort of the left and the right, you have this compressed sort of sandwich between ground plane and this overhead plane, and how they interact creates a very strong sense of volume, even more so if we sort of were to find the volume plane. If we were to take the overhead plane, combine it with a wall plane, for instance, now we're starting to see sort of how the sort of outer confines of the overhead plane can be extruded down to the ground plane in order to create that volume. And you could even do this with linear shapes instead of the volume shapes, and maybe something like this, where there's not actually a physical overhead plane, it's more of a conceptual idea. And so let's go ahead and start playing a little bit more with some combinations of this. We've got here this is kind of a miniaturized overhead plane, and combined with sort of the wall, it creates a nice idea of a volume. It's even stronger if we were to sort of enforce the corners of the cube. So here we have essentially, I guess, 6 corners of the cube sort of represented by the intersections or corners of the geometry. So, but the final 2 are kind of left to imagination, but we sort of fill it in with our own idea of perception. So even more, just kind of another sort of test. And broken down architecture always has that sort of sense, as I was saying earlier, of kind of extending outwards, and your imagination sort of fills in the gaps. And here, as you see, an example of creating kind of a full volume of this space, but the player has the ability to sort of see inside it and understand sort of the idea of the shape, as opposed to if you were to compare this to sort of our original template, which was the just solid cube.